thankful for her wavy stories. Hold on to the lifetime we won't get back. I know these rivers carry on. People tend to stick to you after time. Places tend to do the same as we do. This river carries on and on.
Hello and welcome to Kankakee Podcast, where we talk about the people and places of Kankakee County. I'm Jake LaMore, and before we get too deep into this episode, I want to give a shout out to Chicago Dough Company in Bourbonnais for providing my girlfriend and I with an amazing dinner the other night. We love going there on a regular basis, and we actually went there for dinner after a Kankakee Podcast meeting and had a delicious cauliflower crust pizza, which is one of our favorites there, among many other things like their breadsticks and salad. And what I love about the Chicago Dough cauliflower crust is that it doesn't taste like you're biting into cauliflower crust. I feel like you're eating a regular pizza crust from Chicago Dough. So please show them some love and support. They're one of the greatest pizza places here in the county, if not the greatest. So if you want to order online today, you can do so at chicagodough.com and then have it delivered right to your door tonight, or maybe for lunch, or whenever it is that you're listening to this. They're obviously not open for breakfast, but maybe one day they'll make that happen. So shout out to Tim and everyone else at Chicago Dough for all of their support for Kankakee Podcast. So today on this episode, we're focusing on Bourbonnais as well, which is why I thought it would be great to mention a Bourbonnais business like Chicago Dough. We are talking about the 1837 Log Schoolhouse that is officially being unveiled tomorrow if you happen to be listening to this episode before November 15th. I am pleased to welcome Dr. Charles Balesi, who is one of the wonderful board members at the Bourbonnais Grove Historical Society, and he kind of walks us through the 1837 Log Schoolhouse. Dr. Charles Balesi, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Jack.
Yes.
Long time. We know each other.
We have known each other. Right. It's at least 10 years, I think. At least. Yeah. So it's great to have you here on the podcast today. And the day this episode is being released, the following day is when the opening ceremony is going to be for the Bourbonnais Log Schoolhouse. Mm-hmm. That's something that everyone can go to in Bourbonnais. That we encourage everyone to go if you happen to be listening to this before the ceremony or even after the ceremony. I mean, it's going to be there for hopefully all of eternity now.
Yes, yes, certainly. You know, it took a lot of work, a lot of money, I must say, to get this going. But amazingly, this Log Schoolhouse survived, which is amazing in itself. You know, that's from 1837. And as you know, there's a lot of so-called urban removal, which is not exactly what's good for history and preservation. But this Log Schoolhouse survived.
This was found in what? It was 2000, it was about 10 years ago, right? When this house was discovered, when the Log Schoolhouse was discovered?
Yes, it was part of another building. And they decided to demolish the building. They discovered that inside the building was a log schoolhouse. I mean, they realized what the schoolhouse later on, but they discovered the logs. And this is actually a construction which from a school also became a house from different French-Canadian families. And this is so this is why this is historical on many levels. One level is, of course, 1837, when it was put together. But later on, when it became the house of different French Canadian families, that is certainly interesting in many ways.
To me, it's just mind-blowing that it wasn't known that the school log house was inside this other building until they started demolishing it.
Yeah.
Right? There was no knowledge of that?
Yes, well, they realized it when they start demolishing it. And of course, then you have local historians, like, Vic Johnson and certainly Jim Paul and a lot of people who did a lot of work, on that domain, who will start looking. And also, I salute the village of Bourbonnais, which intervened to make sure the logs will be saved and put together in a warehouse owned by the village of Bourbonnais.
Did we know about this log house before it was discovered in 2011, or what did we know before?
I don't think. I think the local historians, and I'm thinking Vic Johnson and maybe Adrien Richard, knew about an existing log schoolhouse, but I do not think they knew where it was located. Or if they knew, I don't think they realized the importance, because it was when it was transformed into a lodging back in 1850. I think the family was Legris, and the different. There are two French Canadian families. In fact, some of the descendants will be at the opening or official opening, which is quite exciting.
That's very exciting. And I did see there is the Legris house. It was just a sign put up next to it. Exactly. Now, that's not where the log house was, though, right?
No. The log house was about maybe 500 feet away from where it is. The log house has been transferred next to the Tourneau house, and the Tourneau house also survived. Originally the Tourneau house, which is the headquarters of the Bourbonnais Grove Historical Society, was destined to be used by the fire department as an example to destroy and take a fire down. And at that time, I think about 15 years ago, this was stopped and saved. So the Le Tourneau house was moved to where it is now, not to be basically not far from the city hall of the village. And then the whole area, which actually the land belonged to the village of Bourbonnais, but is a kind of lease for $1 a year or something like this to the Bourbonnais Grove Historical Society. So what you have now, because the Log Schoolhouse is rebuilt next to the Le Tourneau house, you have now a sort of a campus, which is quite interesting because it's right in the heart of Bourbonnais, if we can call it that way. So you have a campus with a Le Tourneau house, with a gardens around, and now the Log Schoolhouse. It has been done a beautiful job of rebuilding together. About 60% of the logs are original. Unfortunately, some of the logs were infested by termites, because at the time when the log schoolhouse was built, it was built directly on the ground. There was no idea of protection. And I think the schoolhouse was just a dirt floor.
Oh, I'm sure it was.
so some of the logs could not be used for the rebuilding, but they've been used probably for kind of a fence around the property or something of this type.
And I'm imagining, and I could be wrong, but there's a chance this is probably the oldest building in the county now, or close to
probably. And I wonder if it's not in the Tri-County, because 1837, you don't have anything, to my knowledge, around, neither in Will County. Probably there's some remnant at the island Lacache, possibly, but this is really the oldest building, not in Illinois, of course.
No.
You have in Cahokia and Prairie du Rocher, so you have, very much older buildings. But for the Kankakee County, for sure.
Yeah, and this would have been, going back to the beginning of the schoolhouse to 1837, was Bourbonnais founded by that time?
Barely, because without going to local history 101, what you have, there was a couple of French people, or French people descent, but they were speaking French, and this was still when in the 1820s, 1830s, the land was very much the same it was back 100 years before. So you had French traders who had Potawatomi wives, and they were trying to develop the area along the river. This is when they went to villages around Montreal, and they suggested that the French-Canadian family could move down there, and there would be a lot of land. It coincided with the fact that it was a very difficult time for the French-Canadian under British or Anglo rules, so to speak. So several dozens, the family moved down to the Bourbonnais, and Bourbonnais was a name of a original settler here who had been there for a long time. His grandfather had been a soldier in the French army under the French regime, so he was not a newcomer. So this is, in other words, the French-Canadian families who left around the villages around Montreal and came to this area did not come blindly. They knew where they were going, and they knew there was a situation where they will be well received, and it was a success. And at first, the church in Quebec province was a little hesitant, but then they got on board, and they sent missionaries as well. And so you have a start. But to be absolutely honest, in 1837, the school was not really organized by French Canadians, but by Americans who lived in this area and saw the importance to have schools. So then, of course, it became a combination of people. But the majority of the people living in that area were French Canadians by and large. This remained so until 1870s, probably. Most of the people there were still French Canadian descent, basically maybe up to the early 1900s.
Are there any documents talking about like what school would have been like at the schoolhouse back in 1837? Is there any?
Your question is very good. And so in order to recreate as authentically as possible the atmosphere of the school, we had to look around for other schools more or less at the same time in other parts of the Midwest, and some in Indiana, I think. So we looked around for artifacts, because it's not going to be an empty room. It's going to be a room where we recreate as much as possible the classroom atmosphere of the time. So we had received several gifts from artifacts more or less of that period, which will be inside the classroom, recreate the classroom, like, for instance, a portrait of Washington or a flag from the period, a copy of the Declaration of Independence, all sorts of artifacts which will give a feeling more of what it must have been at the time, and also up to the fact that you have a place to attach the horses if you had to come from a certain place away. So we aimed at recreate as much as possible an atmosphere as it was to be as authentic as possible in order to offer to the new generations, and we hope to have a lot of visitors from the school district, far and wide and locally, to have them a feeling of what it was to be a student in those days.
Oh, yes. My gosh, I can only imagine. Going back to that documentation, was there even documentation of like names of the kids that attended?
We do have the names, yeah.
You do?
We do have the names of the people who attended. We do have the names of the people who built it. Don't ask me to repeat them now, I won't remember them. But they will be, we are going to publish a little booklet, so to speak, which will go along with the building and will give details about how the school came to be and who was responsible to get it going. So we are going to have very precise information, including clear information about the different families who live there. There's one time a family had 10 children. It's hard to imagine having 10 children already. I don't know if you can imagine that. I have 4. It was a lot. 10 children, and lived in a kind of, 1 room or 2 room situation. Just hard to believe. But, apparently in those days, there's a sense of community, a sense of helping each other, and not great expectations.
Right, exactly. And it's kind of served as a community building too, right? It wasn't just a schoolhouse. Is that correct?
Yes, it became was a preacher, a Methodist preacher. He was used as a church, or I would say perhaps more correctly, a meeting room, a religious meeting room at the time. So it had different roles. It probably at the beginning was one of the few completed building, because 1837 to 1845, most of the French Canadians had barely type of housing which you can imagine in those days, much more like longhouse, like the Native Americans used to live in. So even considering the type of weather we have, this must have been a little rough, to put it mildly.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
It's still a work in progress, so to speak. You have to understand that to get to the point where we are, and if you look at the Log Schoolhouse today, the work done by the contractor have been extraordinary, remarkably done extremely well. Of course, it was rebuilt along the requirements of today. The zoning, the foundations are extremely solid, but basically everything else is authentically as possible. And this costed a lot of money, and we raised a lot of money. We were helped a lot, and certainly Mayor Shaw and his assistant Laurie Sear had done an extraordinary job to help it along. They became enthusiastic, and it's not usual, very often, fortunately, the administration of some cities or villages, when you tell them you are going to recreate something which existed, something like 2 centuries ago, they have their doubts. But contrary to this attitude, Mayor Shaw and his assistant, Laurie Sear, who was extraordinarily helpful, just bought on the idea, and they became very enthusiastic. It is going to be something unique for Bourbonnais and the county.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And to kind of give people an idea of where it was originally, I know the address is 493 South Main Street, where the schoolhouse originally was, which present day at this time, I believe, is actually right next to the Mi Casa Mexican restaurant, right?
Yeah,
that empty lot
like
there.
Yeah, because at the time this was the heart of Bourbonnais. Bourbonnais at the time was a long street, so to speak, a long road with building on each side, and it was not a large settlement because the French sort of spread out a little bit in all directions. So Bourbonnais, even at the time, never had a really perhaps a downtown, if I may so use
right.
that word. Okay, so it has been in sort of a tradition, the way the French Canadians, by and large, established themselves with a lot of space around their house. I mean, relatively a lot of space, perhaps at least a couple of acres, instead of being very close. So Bourbonnais at the time was kind of spread already, and so we, today we still have the same situation.
Yeah. And do you know how the Legree family ended up getting?
Well, the Legree family came, I believe, in 1850s. The bulk of the French Canadian families, mainly once the Catholic Church gave its blessing, if I may say so, they came in 1850s and 60s. So you're talking about, perhaps 200 families, which doesn't sound like much, but keep in mind that those families have a large number of children. So if you multiply, by 5 or 6 or even 10, all of a sudden, a generation later, you have a very, very large group. And this is why, if you look on the telephone book today, you have a lot of French names surviving, including yours, by the way.
Right, yes, including me, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Including yours,
Yep.
We happen to have in our group a very, very good person as far as genealogy, whose name is Norma Meyer. And she's remarkable. I think she has worked in many of those genealogies because, again, you don't talk about, you talk about 5, 6 generations, maybe 8 the maximum. And the Catholic Church kept good records, and most of those records are available. It's not impossible to have a good idea of who was there.
So she was able to figure out that they somehow acquired the Log Schoolhouse through genealogy, the Legree family.
I think it was the land was up for sale when it was no longer a meeting room, a meeting house from the Methodist. You had an itinerant Methodist preacher who used that building. Since after that, I think by 1850s it became a lodging. So it's in a way the period during which this building was used as a school was limited. Therefore, perhaps some people say, well, you should hyphen it, the title, Log Schoolhouse and lodging. But essentially,
it probably didn't have a name, right? Did it even have a name?
No. It's I think it was just called the schoolhouse.
The schoolhouse, yeah.
Yeah. So eventually, the fact it was built as such thing is really what counts. In how it was used later on is important, and we are going to mention this within the building itself. We'll have a chart, I think, of the genealogical chart. We'll have authentic photographs of the families inside the building as well. We are not ignoring that part. It's in a way it's interesting because it's the way things evolved. They don't remain the same, and the question of opportunity and use what you have at the time.
Yeah, and I'm still just blown away that, a building was built around this schoolhouse, and that was, so it was used as almost like kind of like a frame then?
Yes, I think it's a good idea. Why, people were extremely careful with what they got. So here you have that log building, okay, and seriously built, strongly built, and you were not going to demolish. You were going to use it. You could have used, of course, the logs. But then why? There's a room already existing. Only thing you have to do maybe is to add a couple of windows and add a couple of rooms, make it more comfortable inside, maybe with plaster or something. So they make use of what you got. It's a little bit like if you have old clothing from your older brother. Well, you kind of cut it down a little bit, and here you go. You have a new outfit for the other member of the family. In other words, things were precious and expensive, and you're not going to about to get rid of them. We are now became a society which wastes an enormous quantity of material goods, not even talking about food.
Sure.
But in those days, everything counted. Mm-hmm. Everything was important, not only in North America, all around the world. And
yeah, I mean, for those that are wondering, we mentioned obviously it's right next to the Letourneau house, but that is Stratford Drive, correct?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so Stratford Drive in Bourbonnais, if you go down there, you're going to find that campus where the Log Schoolhouse is.
Exactly.
And
we are
the
almost
other buildings.
We are almost across the city hall.
Yes.
And so we are, and a lot of businesses are around there. You have not far away, you have Starbucks, you have Jewel, you have a lot. In other words, it's not out of nowhere. It's just right in the center and deserved a detour and stopping and see what it is. And also we must also be thankful to the journal, who has done a very, very good job at publicizing our efforts. And I hope after November 15, our success.
Yes, I'm hoping so too. And so after, November 15th, so is it just open to the public?
Yes, we are going to work on that because obviously we need to have somebody here because we are going to have artifacts. So something is going to work out. Like the Letourneau house is open to the public and particularly on Sundays. So we are going to work, we need volunteers. It's not easy to get people to do that, but we need volunteers. So a schedule will be published and we'll work on that. But, it's interesting because one of the meetings, and we had a monthly meeting with, we have a small committee with Mayor Shaw and Laurie Sear and people like Norm Strasma, who is the person who was behind the success of the Lloyd Wright House in Bradley. And we meet regularly, and the mayor is so excited because he said, well, we're doing this, but what next? And next, of course, is the anniversary of the creation of Bourbonnais, the incorporation of Bourbonnais. So there's a nice atmosphere. I think a lot of people now have found a new way to be interested in the past, which made possible to this present. I know it sounds like a cliche, but many cliches are cliches because they are true.
Yes.
And that's the way it is. You have to have a foundation.
Yes.
And we have a good foundation in the Bourbonnais, origins.
Absolutely. And, I'm grateful for all of your work as well, because it took a long time. I'm 10 years, 11 years,
because from the start, it was not a given. When you look at the cost was heavy, and you really start to think, how are we going to able to get enough money to put this together? In the meantime, the logs were, protected in a warehouse, but, this like anything else, warehouse is not exactly a good environment for anything.
Right.
So it happened, it's a kind of a small miracle, so to speak, if you believe in miracles, of course.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So was there anything else interesting about the 1837 Log Schoolhouse? in Bourbonnais? Anything other interesting facts about it?
What was interesting about the children of the time, and I think they were about, if I do remember, we have all their names. They were about 8 or 10, and one of we were trying to, but it's not easy, to find descendants of the children. And, that's quite, but this is not an easy task.
No, because that's a lot of generations.
Yeah, well, yes, yeah, relatively, and people move also.
That too, yeah.
Yeah, people move,
or the families die out. Their families don't reproduce, and
right, exactly. So this is and we were trying to find who was teaching. That's not easy to find either. And definitely it was a man, because in those days only men were teaching. This later on you had women, but the requirements were severe as far as being able to teach in school. And later on, of course, the nuns were predominant here. I mean, basically, they took over. They actually, the Catholic Church was actually the only establishment teaching for decades in the Bourbonnais area. So
if you had to go to school, that's where you would go. There was no public
you have no
school.
Choice. No,
you had no choice. Okay, wow.
You have no choice. The existence of that log school was a kind of, I would say, a challenge from the start. I'm trying to get in the mind of the people who decided they needed a school. So obviously they did it, and they wanted to have a school. So now people talk a lot about homeschooling, and certainly you had per force in many families homeschooling because you didn't have any choice. But to make the step of creating a place dedicated to school outside any home, I think was a great step. I hope that somehow, maybe in some archives, we'll find some correspondence about it. It may exist in private archives.
Sure.
It may exist in some county archives. I don't know at this point.
Right. Yeah, it's an ongoing thing. So, but I think it's super exciting that the ball continues to roll.
Yeah.
Even though the schoolhouse is erected, it's still continued. The research continues.
And furthermore, because it's rebuilt, all of a sudden you have a lot of people, all as a relative, who all of a sudden appear out of nowhere and say, "Oh, I had something to do. My great-grandmother was in a single-room school, and here's some artifacts." And other people who have some relation with this area. So the fact we have this building is going to help to probably, or at least I hope, maybe not probably, but perhaps to help to find and to wake up some people who in their distant memory heard about something in their own family. I'm hopeful that having the building itself will generate interest. And if you have a generated interest, some people have been in this area long enough, or who have moved away from the area but kept a relationship with the area, will come up with a newfound.
Yeah.
And already it happened. It already happened.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure that is bound to happen as word gets out more and more about the Log Schoolhouse and there's obviously still a lot of the original families, French-Canadian families from the area in Kankakee County. So as word gets out, there's bound to hopefully uncover even more fascinating artifacts or just information about either the schoolhouse or just the area as a whole. So if anyone does discover something and they're like, I wonder if they would be interested in this, I mean, they can just reach out to the Bourbonnais Grove Historical Society.
Absolutely. In fact, we have quite a few donations continuously by people who find things in their home. In fact, we are in a situation at the Le Tourneau House where we have no more room. And for this reason, there's a room that the City Hall of Bourbonnais has organized for the surplus of artifacts. It generates interest, and unfortunately, we are limited in space. The Latourneau House is relatively a small building, and we have to do a sort of triage to make sure we show and we display objects which are linked with the house. You want to avoid to become a kind of antique roadshow on steroids. You don't want that.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's a triage going on, and it's always the problem because you need a curator, and it's not easy task.
Charles, is there anything else you want to add about the Log Schoolhouse?
Well, I hope that everybody interested drops by, and I have in front of me the program, and we'll start at 2:00, and on Stratford Drive East, there will be, of course, official recognition. We'll have a ceremonial reopening. We have music and songs. We are going to have organized tours. I hope as many people can come. This is open. We cannot close the street to traffic, but there's room. There's a lot of room, and the French Consul General will be there.
Oh, that's
a
representation
exciting. From the Quebec delegation will be there as well, because the government of Quebec has its own delegation in Chicago and many other places. So it's going to be a happening, very pleasant, joyous happening. We hope the weather will cooperate and will not be ferociously cold.
Right.
But
yeah.
we'll have a tent. We have a tent, and I think some refreshments will be served. And of course, later on at the Kankakee Country Club, we have a dinner, which is a small fundraising dinner at 5:30, because once our schoolhouse is open, we have to maintain. Let's not forget, things requires attention, and every building requires to be maintained. So we no longer have to raise a big money, but still we have to keep in making sure we have enough funds to keep this in shape for the generations of the future. That's the whole idea. We want to transfer the tradition. We want to transfer the memory. In other words, safekeeping the past is an ongoing activities oriented towards the future.
I could not agree more. Well, Charles, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to talk with us.
It was a pleasure, Jack. Okay, and good luck in your activities, and hopefully a lot of people will listen to that and will show up.
I'm sure they
will.
will.
November 15 at 2:00.
Yes, I'm hoping so, and I'm looking forward to seeing you there.
Okay, all right. Thank you again.
All right. Thanks, Charles. Thank you once again to Dr. Charles Balesi for being on Kankakee Podcast today to tell us about the Bourbonnais 1837 Log Schoolhouse. It is officially open now. As of tomorrow, the official unveiling happens. So if you are very interested in seeing what this schoolhouse looks like, you can go to Stratford Drive in Bourbonnais and check it out. Obviously, they're only open certain hours and days of the week. So you want to plan your trip accordingly, right, to go to the museum campus there on Stratford Drive in Bourbonnais. I'm Jake LaMore. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Kankakee Podcast. Also, a special thank you to our patrons for helping make this episode possible, and that includes Karen Bishop, Jake Lee, Jesse Arsenault, Dave Barron, Daryl Damper, Samantha Rockanowski, Lake Iverson, Travis Garcia, Jane Bostwick, Dawn Harrison, Simon Topless, Scott Wright, Carrie O'Connell, Jamie Race, Joanne Berry, Anthony Vicelli, Eric Olson, Carl Earps, Jeff and Rosa Carroll, Teague Dreenan, Sandy and Steve Twait, and Rose Lucky. Now, to become a podcast patron, go to KankakeePodcast.com, click on the Patron tab, and if you pledge $5 or more per month, you'll also hear your name announced on an episode. There's also other rewards like early access to new episodes. There's video versions of select episodes. There's even extended versions of some episodes where you can hear an additional 40 to 60 minutes of that person talking about whatever subject it is about Kankakee County. There's also discounts on special events and so much more. So your monthly pledge is truly appreciated. Our monthly goal right now is to reach $400 per month. We're about 37% away from reaching that goal. So please sign up for the patron program today at KankakeePodcast.com. Our theme song is written and performed by Lupe Carroll and recorded by Daniel Bishop.
This river